Is demographics destiny? And if it is, to what extent? Let's explore. Hello everyone, and welcome to another installment of Freedom Alternative Research and Analysis. A little over 10 years ago, in January 2006, Mark Steyn would publish an article called "It's the Demography, Stupid?", an article which soon after became a best-selling book called "America Alone: The End of the World as We Know It." It's a good book which I recommend to anyone watching this video, even though I think Steyn is mostly wrong. There are quite a few claims in his book that are wild and rather extraordinary, for which the absolutely necessary extraordinary evidence simply doesn't exist. Nevertheless, the raw numbers are correct, or better said, were correct at the time when it was written. But before we get to where Steyn is wrong, let's dwell a bit on where he is correct. And the reason I'm focusing on Mark Steyn is because he is the one who repopularized the phrase "demographics is destiny," even though obviously he isn't the only one to have ever made such an observation. In the book America Alone, as well as in numerous interviews and articles, Mark Steyn makes the very pertinent observation that the expansion of the welfare state has destroyed, or at the very least severely undermined, the very fabric of the nations of Europe. He then continues to point towards the fact that organized religion was replaced by secular progressivism, which, unfortunately for progressives, doesn't promote breeding the way previous dominant ideologies did, and that's a problem. Let's read a bit from Steyn's 10 years anniversary article on this topic. Quote, "When it comes to forecasting the future, the birth rate is the nearest thing to hard numbers. If only 1 million babies are born in 2006, it's hard to have 2 million adults enter the workforce in 2026, or 2033, or 2037, or whenever they get around to finishing their anger management and queer studies degrees. And the hard data on babies around the Western world is that they're running out a lot faster than the oil is. Replacement fertility rate, i.e. the number you need for merely a stable population, not getting any bigger, not getting any smaller, is 2.1 babies per woman. Some countries are well above that. The global fertility rate leader, Somalia, is 6.91. Niger is 6.83, Afghanistan is 6.78, Yemen 6.75. Notice what those nations have in common? Enter Islam, which sportingly volunteered to be the children we couldn't be bothered having ourselves, and which kind offer was somewhat carelessly taken up by the post-Christian West. As I wrote a decade ago, the design flaw of the secular social democratic state is that it requires a religious society birth rate to sustain it. Post-Christian hyper-rationalism is, in the very objective sense, a lot less rational than Catholicism or Mormonism. Indeed, in its reliance on immigration to ensure its future, the European Union has adopted a 21st century variation on the strategy of the Shakers, who are forbidden from reproducing and thus could increase their numbers only by conversion. That didn't work out too great for the Shakers, but the Europeans figured it would be a piece of cake for them. Westernization is so seductive, so appealing that, notwithstanding the occasional frothing imam and burqa-bagged crone, their young Muslims would fall for the siren song of secular progressivism, just like they themselves had. So as long as you kept the immigrants coming, there would be no problem, as long as you whoomhead up the scale of the solution. Now, you can't really argue with that, can you? So, is demographics destiny? Well, in a very raw sense, yes, of course it is, and the Shakers example provided by Steyn is probably the most extreme scenario where it is made clear that demographics is indeed destiny. But is it always the case? And more importantly, to what extent is this the case? Now let me explain. Mark Steyn and most of the others who sound the alarm bell on the demographic winter are indeed correct in identifying the reasons and, for the most part anyway, in interpreting the data. but they rarely ask the hard questions, and because they don't ask the hard questions, their proposals for addressing the issue tend to be worse than the status quo. Again, that's in general. Stein is actually the smallest offender in this department. If you look at what the leftists say about this, Stein actually sounds like a fluffy kitten. It's just that the leftists are even worse in their proposed trade-offs. So what are the hard questions? Well, for starters, so what? Many alarmists warn that, for instance, Portugal's population could drop from 10.6 million people today to 6.3 million people in 2060. When I hear that, I'm like, yes, so what? Why should this be a problem? Portugal built an empire at some point in history with a population of 4 million people. So to suggest that Portugal cannot continue to exist as a nation with 6.3 million people just 45 years from now with modern technology simply doesn't follow. They were able to be an empire with a lot less technology than now and with a lot less people than now. Another hard question should be, why not use the opportunity? You see, every crisis, be it an economic, political, and in this case demographic, comes with an opportunity. Now, not using that opportunity yourself means that someone else will use it. And here comes the un-PC part where Stein is indeed correct. The Muslims are using the opportunity. We don't. A shrinking population is a good opportunity to rethink the Ponzi schemes that crippled the nations of Europe to begin with. I know it sounds radical, but at least think about it for a few seconds. The main rationale for importing so many people without any form of control was, and still is to a certain extent, to make sure that there is a base to be taxed in order to keep the various Ponzi schemes, such as the state pension systems, the so-called free healthcare, which in reality is neither free nor worthy of the name healthcare, or in the case of Sweden, Italy, and a few others, the schemes of elderly care. A shrinking population is a good opportunity to start admitting not just that importing people was a mistake, but that the whole edifice of these schemes is not only morally reprehensible, but downright wrong. Now let me put it this way. Up until a generation ago, the elders in most of Europe, East and West, were taken care of by their families. My great-grandma, born at the end of the 19th century, who died at the beginning of the 21st century, died at home, surrounded by her family. The concept of going into a state-funded or even a private one institution for elderly people was appalling both to her and her daughter, that would be my grandmother. But that was 15 years ago. Nowadays, it is regarded as awkward to care for the elderly at home, and in some countries of Europe, even slightly illegal if the elderly person is declared incapable of making certain decisions. Up until very recently, caring for your own children was part of the responsibility of normal adults. Nowadays, not giving your children into state-run kindergartens can literally lead to the kidnapping of your children from your family. Just ask the tens of thousands of victims of the Norwegian Barnevernet, though admittedly Norway is an extreme example, just like Germany, where the SWAT team equivalent can storm your house for daring to refuse to give your child to the state indoctrination program. You see, people respond to incentives, and the incentives right now are not the way Mark Stein and others would want them to be. And here's where I think Stein is wrong. Not only the incentives right now aren't the way Stein would want them to be, but they should never be the way he would want them to be. Stein and others propose that Europe should start having more babies of its own in order to compete with the immigrant population. Now, from a utilitarian perspective, the proposal isn't really such a bad idea. It's just that it isn't realistic. You see, birth rates and fertility rates do not shrink or increase overnight. It takes time, and they most definitely do not change the way many demographic alarmists think they do. What most alarmists miss from the picture is that there are quantifiable factors that shrink or increase the birth rate of any population. Factors that have been seen at work time and time again throughout history. One such factor is economic well-being. Take Bangladesh, for example, a Muslim nation where Islamic violence against non-Muslims is commonplace. The fertility rate of Bangladesh in 1960 was 6.72 children per woman. By 1970, it had risen to 6.95. That was more than the top breeder of today, which is Niger, with a fertility rate of 6.89 children per woman. What's the fertility rate of Bangladesh today? 2.07. That's similar to Mexico, Argentina, the United States, Ireland, Faroe Islands, or France. Only two factors have changed radically since 1970 in Bangladesh: increased availability of contraceptives, thanks to capitalism and economic growth, and decreased infant mortality, also thanks to capitalism and vaccines. If anything, the level of religiosity in Bangladesh is higher now than in 2000, when Bangladesh's fertility rate stood at 3.12 children per woman. Now, the reason I give Bangladesh as an example is because it fits the profile of other countries routinely cited by alarmists such as Pakistan or Somalia. Now, speaking of these two, the fertility rate of Pakistan in 1981 was 6.5, and in Somalia in the same year it was 7.0. Today, the fertility rate of Pakistan was last measured in 2014 and it stood at 3.6. And the fertility rate of Somalia was still 6.5, though on a decreasing trend from 2011's 6.8 or 2006's 7.2. You may not hear this in the news, but the actual economic conditions in both Pakistan and Somalia have significantly improved since 1981, and every single time drops in fertility rates follows economic growth. So essentially, the proposals that we should all start having 4 kids instead of 1 so we can compete with the migrant population is, at the end of the day, a primitivist argument. And the reason I call it primitivist is because there are essentially 2 ways that are proven to work to convince people to have more kids. One is the Ceausescu way: intentionally make everyone poorer, restrict contraception, and make everyone pay a celibacy tax if they dare not serve the party with at least 5 children. The other way is... the other way is essentially the same way, namely to slow down economic growth and provide goodies at the expense of everyone else for those who serve the party with children. Basically, the only times when people en masse decide to breed more is when they are more primitive, namely when they have a lower standard of living and thus rely on the offspring to work the land with them, or are simply unsure how many of them will even survive till adulthood. But there's good news. Not everything is really that bad. There is another way that almost nobody is willing to talk about because it rubs most people the wrong way, especially in Europe. And the reason this is the case is because the other way may be moral, but it is the hard way. Just as we routinely say here on Freedom Alternative, liberty is not the easy way. It's just the correct way. You want to turn around the trends in Europe? Well, then everyone should start admitting at least the fundamentals. 1. The pension systems are broke. For good. There is no way to fix them. The only concern should be now how to make sure they collapse as easy as possible and with the least amount of people being hurt. 2. There is no such thing as a free lunch. Do you want healthcare? Get ready to pay for it. 3. Do you want to be taken care of when you're old? Now get ready to pay for it or establish a social structure around yourself when you're young. Now that short social structure can be a family or a mutual trust or whatever. And finally 4. No, not everyone has a right to live in Europe. I know that's radical, but it's still the truth. To test this, try emigrating into China as a European. See how that works out? It is completely insane to practice this open doors policy when literally everyone else, from the United States to China, from India to Russia, from Nigeria to Mexico, and everyone in between, does not practice an open door policy. To put it in simpler words, Europe can thrive with fewer people. After all, the total population of Europe during the 19th century was a 1/3 of what it is now, and Europe had glory, had wealth, had scientific progress, and in many ways had a lot more freedom than it has now. In the interwar period, which is usually the best period for almost all countries of Europe, except the USSR and Germany, but particularly the USSR, the total population of Europe was around 350 million people, including Eastern Russia. Today, the European Union alone has 508 million people, and Europe as a whole, with Western Russia, Belarus, Norway, and so on included, has a little over 740 million inhabitants. Even if all the alarmist predictions come true and if immigration is halted to negligible levels, the population of Europe would still be around 550 million people by the end of this century. Again, that's assuming that nothing will convince native Europeans to have more children than they do now. So the idea that Europe necessarily has to suffer because of this simply doesn't make sense. Europe gave the world a lot of fabulous things, both in science and in culture, with far fewer people than what it has now. Now I can already hear the typing. So what then? Everyone just calm down and waits because demographics don't matter? I won't blame anyone for at least thinking that, because every time someone brings up any argument that is not alarmist in some way, shape or form with respect to the demographic trends in Europe, that's the usual retort. Now what I am saying though is that while demographics do matter, they are certainly not the only factor. Not even by a long shot. The current crisis of Europe will not be solved even if tomorrow all countries of Europe raise their fertility rate from 1.55, which is the average European rate right now, to, let's say, 5.55, which is a rate that Europe hasn't had for over 200 years. The current crisis of Europe, however, will at least begin to be solved if at least a few of the countries of Europe start turning their cultures around and bring back some good old sanity in them. For instance, in 1984, many of us in Eastern Europe were destined to die of starvation under the boot of communism. That eventually did not happen because things were turned around by various factors and actions. Now, was that a perfect solution? Perhaps not, but it was undoubtedly the superior trade-off. Same is true now for most of Europe. Turning things around and bringing back sanity is not the perfect solution, because perfect doesn't exist. But it is the superior trade-off to just starting having more children randomly. And with that being said, thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon on Freedom Alternative.